Alice had always thought that the worst part of loss wasn't the pain, but the silence that comes afterward. That same silence crept into the room every morning when she woke up, with no reason to hurry anywhere. Once she had a job, a schedule, a sense that her days had a shape. Now the days spread out, like ink dissolving in water. She found the notice by accident, crumpled, pinned to a bulletin board between an ad for a math tutor and a missing cat. Assistant needed for a private library, experience not required, silence required. No address, only a time. For some reason, it felt like an invitation rather than a job. The house stood in the old part of the city, where the asphalt still remembered horses' hooves, and the streetlights shone as if they were ashamed of their own light. The door opened without a sound, as though it had been waiting for her. Inside, it was warm. Not just physically, it was the kind of warmth found in places where memory has lived for a long time. The fireplace crackled, casting living shadows across shelves that rose all the way to the ceiling. The books stood tightly packed, different in size and age, some in worn leather bindings, others with smooth, almost new covers. The air smelled of dust, paper, and something faintly sweet, like old letters. "You're right on time," a voice came from deep within the hall. He appeared as if he had always been there. Tall, in a dark suit without a single crease, with a face that was hard to remember, not because it was plain. On the contrary, it was too perfect. His eyes looked attentive, but without curiosity, like those of someone who already knew the answers. I'm Alice," she said, suddenly feeling that her name sounded different here. Quieter, heavier. "I am the curator," he replied. "We rarely use names here." He led her between the shelves. Their footsteps vanished into the carpet, and it felt as though the building itself was listening. Alice ran her fingers along the spines of the books and flinched. For a moment, one of them felt warm. "You have a lot of books," she said, trying to make her voice sound normal. "We have exactly as many as we need," the curator replied. "Your duties are simple. Keep things in order, tend to the fireplace, receive visitors, though they come rarely." "And what kind of library is this?" she asked. He stopped and looked upward, towards where the highest shelves disappeared into the half-light. "This is a library of stories that have not yet become memories." Alice wanted to laugh, but the sound got stuck somewhere between her chest and her throat. "There is only one rule," he added, his voice growing firmer. "Never touch the books on the upper shelves without my permission." "Why?" The curators smiled, for the first time. "Because some stories do not like being read too early." When he left her alone, Alice sat by the fireplace. The fire moved as if it were reading an invisible text along with her. She didn't know how much time passed before she heard a very soft sound. A rustle. Alice looked up. On the upper shelf, one of the books was slowly, almost cautiously, turning its own page. And in that moment, she understood. The silence here was not empty. It was alive. That night, Alice couldn't fall asleep for a long time. It felt as though the library's silence had clung to her, like the smell of smoke to clothes. She caught herself listening, as if between heartbeats, someone were turning pages. In the morning, the house greeted her with the same warmth. The fireplace was already burning, though she was certain she had extinguished it with her own hands the night before. The fire crackled evenly, as if it were breathing. "You've adopted quickly," the curator said without turning around. "That's rare." "To what exactly?" Alice asked cautiously. "To the fact that nothing here is explained all at once." Her tasks truly were simple. Reshelve a few books, wipe away dust, check entries in an old journal with no dates. Yet the longer she moved between the shelves, the more clearly she felt it.
The library disliked haste. Everything here happened more slowly, or more deeply. She noticed something strange closer to noon. Some books had no authors, not worn-out names, not faded letters, just a blank space, as if there had never been anything there at all. "Is this a bindbinder's mistake?" she asked, showing one of them to the curator. He took it, resting his fingers on the spine a little longer than necessary. "No," he replied, "it's a consequence." "Of what?" "Of forgetting." Alice opened the book at random and immediately understood. This was not a novel. The text was too precise. The person on the pages thought the way people think in real life, in fragments, doubts, small fears. The dialogue was awkward, full of pauses and things left unsaid. In one place, the character forgot where he'd put his keys and turned back halfway. Such a small thing, yet it sent a chill through Alice. "Is this a diary?" she whispered. "It's a story," the curator said, "just not embellished yet." She read on. There were no dates in the text, but there were names of ordinary streets, bus stops, cafes she herself had once visited. Unease crept over her. "And these people, are they real?" she asked. The curator was silent for a long time before answering. "They are possible." Later, after he left, Alice noticed the photographs lining the walls. Black and white, yellowed with age, some framed, others simply pinned with thumbtacks. They showed people, couples, families, solitary figures by windows. She stopped before one of them, a young man and a woman sitting on a park bench, smiling, slightly blurred. Alice could have sworn she'd seen this photograph yesterday, and there had been 3 people in it. She blinked. "No, only 2. "That's impossible," she whispered, leaning closer. In the evening, just before closing, Alice returned to the book without an author. She only meant to glance at a few pages, to convince herself it was nothing more than a strange stylistic choice. But when she opened it, her heart tightened. The text was different. A paragraph she'd read that morning was gone. In its place was a new one, about a person hesitating whether to go home, then deciding to take a different road. Alice was certain this hadn't been there. "No," she breathed. The letters seemed to be shifting, settling into the paper. The ink looked fresh, alive. Behind her, the floor creaked. "You've begun to notice," the curator said calmly. "That means the library has accepted you." "The text is changing, right now. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you wouldn't have believed me then. Now you will." She lifted her gaze upward to where the upper shelves disappeared. A half-light reigned there, thick as twilight before a storm. "What's up there?" she asked. The curator didn't answer right away. "There are stories up there," he finally said, "that have not yet become reality." And somewhere high above them, once again, came the soft, almost careful rustle of a page being turned. After the curator's words, the library no longer seemed merely strange. It became wary, like an animal that had allowed her to come closer, but had not yet decided whether to bite. Alice tried to work as before, shelving books, wiping dust, making notes in the journal. Yet her gaze kept drifting upward again and again to where the shelves drowned in shadow and the air seemed thicker. She felt it almost physically, like a light pressure at her temples when you stare too long at something forbidden. "You're looking up there too often," the curator remarked calmly. "And you answer too rarely," she shot back before she could stop herself. He didn't take offense. On the contrary, the corner of his lips twitched almost imperceptibly. That, too, is a form of answer. Alice was about to turn away when she noticed something new. On the upper shelf, between two dark, untitled volumes, stood a book with a light-colored cover. It stood out sharply from the rest, clean, almost modern, and on its spine was a name: Alice V. The world shifted, as if someone had taken a step sideways and pulled reality along with them. She didn't remember moving closer, only the cold of the wood beneath her palm when she touched the ladder. "I wouldn't advise it," the curator said softly. He stood a few steps away, but he didn't stop her. "Is this a joke?" Her voice trembled. "Did you put it there yourself?" "No," he replied. "The library never jokes." Alice froze. Her fingers were almost touching the book, but she forced herself to lower her hand. "Then I don't want to read it," she said sharply and climbed down the ladder. "Not now." The curator nodded as if he had been expecting exactly that decision. She went to another shelf, also high but slightly lower, within what was allowed. The books there were darker, heavier, their spines nameless. One of them seemed to draw her gaze. Alice pulled it out and sat by the fireplace. The book opened easily. It was the story of a man, lonely, taciturn, with a life made up of work, brief conversations with neighbors, and evenings by the window. He wasn't unhappy, rather empty. The text didn't try to evoke sympathy, yet it came on its own. As Alice read, she caught herself on a strange feeling, as if she had known this person before. Not his face, but the rhythm of his thoughts, his habit of stopping in the middle of a sentence, his way of avoiding mirrors. Page after page, the story slowly moved toward its end. The ending was short, without pathos, without farewell words, just a description of an accident on a night road, flashing headlights, the sense that he hadn't managed to call someone. The final line was thin, almost shy. He never found out that he was loved. Alice closed the book more abruptly than she intended. Pain pulsed in her chest, someone else's, yet far too close. "This hasn't happened yet, right?" The curator stood in the shadows between the shelves. "Not yet," he replied, "but it has every chance to." "Can I change something?" she asked without turning around. "The question isn't whether you can, it's whether you can endure the consequences." Alice fell silent. Before her eyes stood not the text, but the feeling of it, of a person slowly disappearing without leaving a trace. When she left the library that evening, the city seemed unbearably loud. Cars, voices, shop lights, everything was sharp, as if reality were deliberately reminding her of itself. She walked down the street, still thinking about the book, when she suddenly stopped. Across from a cafe, under a dim street lamp, stood a man, alone. He was looking through the window without going inside, as if weighing something very simple and at the same time impossible. Alice recognized him instantly, not by his face, by the silence around him. And in that moment she understood. The story had stepped beyond the pages. Alice stood a few meters away from him and couldn't bring herself to take a step. In the book, this moment had been described differently. She wasn't there. He simply stood, counted the reflections in the cafe window, and eventually walked away without going inside. A small choice that changed nothing. At least that was how it seemed. Now the choice was different. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice sounded chujim, even to herself. The man turned around. His face wasn't what she had imagined, not handsome, not ordinary, calm, as if he had long ago learned not to expect anything extra from the world. "Yes?" he asked. He looked at her attentively but without wariness, the way people look when they have nothing left to lose. "You're not going in?" She nodded toward the cafe, immediately thinking how foolish it sounded. He smiled faintly. "I'm deciding whether it's worth it. The coffee here is always bitter." "He'll say that," flashed through her mind. In the book, it was exactly like this. Bitter doesn't mean bad. Sometimes it's just honest. He studied her, as if trying to decide whether she was serious. "Do you often talk to strangers?" he asked. "Only to those who are easy to lose," slipped out of her. A pause fell. She already regretted the words, but he didn't retreat. "Lucas," he said after a moment. "Alice." They went in together. Inside it was warm, noisy, nothing like the library. Alice caught herself comparing every one of his gestures to the text in the book. He sat by the window, just as it said, ordered black coffee without sugar, just as it said. But in the book, he had been alone. "You look like someone who knows something," Lucas suddenly said, stirring his coffee. "Maybe I'm just good at listening," she replied. He smiled, more genuinely this time. The conversation flowed strangely easily, about small things, work, the city, favorite routes with no destination. He didn't ask much, but every question landed true. Alice noticed that for the first time in a long while, she wasn't trying to fill the pauses. When they stepped outside, it was already dark. She felt a sudden fear, as if with every passing minute she was moving farther away from something important. "Could we meet again?" Lucas asked casually, "if you didn't find this strange." "No," she answered too quickly. "It didn't." They parted at the intersection. Alice was almost running back to the library, though she didn't know why. Inside, it was darker than usual. The fireplace burned weaker, and the shadows on the walls shifted uneasily. "You've already interfered," the curator said as soon as she appeared, "faster than I expected." "I just talked to him. That's not a crime." "For the world, no. For the story, it is." She rushed to the shelf and pulled out Lucas's book. Her heart pounded as she flipped through the pages. The text was different. New lines had appeared between the paragraphs, about the meeting, about the woman whose voice stopped him by the cafe, and one more sentence that hadn't been there before. "She entered his life and disrupted the balance." "Does that mean he'll live?" Alice whispered. The curator looked at the page the way a doctor looks at a fractured bone. "It means," he said slowly, "that the story will now look for a way to even itself out." And somewhere deep within the library, something clicked softly but ominously, as if a mechanism untouched for centuries had begun to move. The next morning, the library greeted Alice with an unusual emptiness. Not a physical one. The shelves stood where they always had, the fireplace burned, the air was the same. But something inside was gone, the way sound vanishes after a sharp click of a switch. She felt it the moment she crossed the threshold. "Something's wrong," she said, without looking at the curator. "Yes," he replied. "Now you feel it too." Alice moved quickly between the shelves. Where a row of dark, untitled books had stood yesterday, there was now an empty space. Dust lay in a smooth stripe, as if the books had been removed long ago, though she remembered them from the night before, down to the smallest crack in their spines. "Where are they?" she asked. "Their stories ended before they began," the curator said calmly. "When you changed one, the others lost their chance to exist." "That's not fair," Alice snapped. "They never even had a chance." "They did," he corrected her, "but you took it for yourself." The words struck painfully because they were true. She clenched her fingers, forcing herself to breathe evenly. "Lucas must not die. His story, it's too quiet. People like him disappear and no one notices." "The library notices everyone," the curator replied, "but it does not save everyone." Alice went to the wall of photographs. She didn't immediately understand what had changed, only felt a familiar dizziness. In several pictures, only backgrounds remained. A park without people, a room with empty chairs, stairs with no footsteps. "They vanished?" she whispered. "They were never completed," said the curator. "Now they won't even exist halfway." That same day, she met Lucas again. He suggested a walk, no plan, no route. They walked in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than in the library, alive. They followed the river, where streetlights reflected in the water as long, trembling lines. Lucas walked a little slower than she did, not deliberately, just out of habit. Alice adjusted her pace, and the gesture felt unexpectedly intimate. "You always walk as if you're in no hurry," she said. "Because when I hurry, life manages to leave without me." She smiled, then noticed he wasn't looking ahead but at her reflection in the water. "What?" she asked. "You look braver there," he said. "Maybe the water knows more about you." Alice stopped. The wind lifted a strand of her hair, and Lucas, instinctively, very carefully tucked it behind her ear, then immediately pulled his hand back, as if startled by his own movement. "Sorry," he said. "Don't apologize," she answered softly. "Just be here." They crossed the bridge. In the middle, Lucas leaned on the railing and looked down. "I used to think all important meetings had to be loud. Now it seems the real ones are quiet, the kind that's easy to miss." "I didn't plan on finding you," Alice admitted. "Neither did I," he said. "But maybe that's why we're here." On a bench near an old chestnut tree, they sat too close for it to be accidental, yet not close enough to be obvious. Their shoulders touched, and the contact was lighter than a breath, but warmth ran down Alice's spine. "Have you ever felt like someone knows you better than you know yourself?" Lucas asked, without looking at her. Alice swallowed. "Yes, and it's more frightening than loneliness." He finally looked at her. There was no insistence in his gaze, only a quiet question. "What if that person doesn't want to change you?" Alice answered without words. She simply allowed herself to lean closer for a moment. Their foreheads nearly touched. The kiss didn't happen, and there was something right about that, as if the story didn't allow it yet. When they stood up, Lucas lightly squeezed her palm. He didn't hold it, just reminded her of his presence. "If I suddenly disappear," he said, half-jokingly, "you'll find me here." "You won't disappear," Alice replied, faster than she could think. He smiled. "You said that like a promise." And that promise, still unfinished, ached sweetly, like love that arrives precisely when it isn't allowed. That evening, Alice returned to the library late. The fireplace burned brighter than usual, and the shadows were sharp, broken. She climbed the ladder to the upper shelves, for the first time without permission. Her heart beat so loudly it felt like the house itself could hear it. The book with her name was heavier than she expected. She opened it. There was no description of death. There was a choice. The pages shifted, as if unable to decide on a version, but one line repeated again and again, unchanged. For him to live, someone must be erased. "You've begun to disappear," the curator's voice sounded behind her. Alice turned sharply. "What does that mean?" Silently, he handed her a photograph, the same one where she stood by the fireplace on her first day of work. In the picture, the fireplace was there, the library was there, but she was not. "The story is already paying," the curator said. "The only question is whether you're ready to pay in full." Alice pressed the book to her chest, realizing that love had turned out not to be a rescue from fate, but a direct challenge to it. The library greeted Alice with a silence that no longer felt comforting. It was taut, like a string stretched to the point of breaking. The fireplace burned, but the flames gave no warmth, only light, sharp and nervous. The shadows on the walls no longer followed the fire's movements. They lagged behind, as if living by a different rhythm. "This place, it isn't here," Alice said, not taking her eyes off the shelves. "And it isn't now." The curator stood by the table where the old journal lay. He closed it carefully, almost tenderly. "You're beginning to see correctly," he replied. "The library does not exist in time. It exists between." Between what? Between choice and consequence. Between what might have happened and what did. Alice felt her chest tighten. "Then who are you?" The curator looked up. For the first time, there was something like weariness in his eyes. "I was a story, one of those that stood on the upper shelves. I had an ending. A bad one, but complete. And one day I refused to accept it. You rewrote yourself? No. I simply stopped moving forward, and the library turned me into what remains when a story refuses to end. Alice said nothing. Everything fell into place. His detachment, the absence of a name, the way he spoke of books not as objects but as living beings. "And my book?" she asked quietly. "What is it really about?" The curator went to the upper shelves and took down the light-colored book with her name. He handed it to her. "It isn't about death, Alice. It's about a choice that has no right answer." She opened the book. The pages no longer trembled. They were empty. Only one line stood in the center, written in black ink. "The one who saves must remain." "Remain where?" she whispered. The answer never came. The air shuddered like a distant blow. Somewhere deep in the library, a book fell with a crash. Then another. Alice jerked her head up. What was that? The curator was no longer looking at her. His gaze was turned aside, as if listening to another world. It's him. The story is seeking balance. Alice's phone vibrated in her pocket. An unknown number. "Hello?" Her voice shook. "Are you acquainted with Lucas? He's been in an accident. Nothing fatal, but you should come." The words scattered in her mind, refusing to form sense. An accident. Not fatal. Not yet. "Where is he?" she whispered. She didn't remember how she got outside. The city was too bright, too real. At the hospital, everything smelled of antiseptic and fear. Lucas lay on the bed with his arm bandaged, pale, but alive. "You came," he said when he saw her. "I knew you would." She sat beside him and for the first time allowed herself to cry. Quietly, without sobbing, the tears simply flowed because otherwise she wouldn't have endured it. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. Lucas gently touched her fingers. "It's strange, but in the moment it happened, I thought of you, and it was like I didn't fall all the way." Those words were frightening than any verdict. When Alice returned to the library, she didn't recognize it. The shelves had shifted, as if someone had altered the architecture of space. Some books were gone entirely. Others had appeared where they never had been before. The photographs on the walls were slowly fading, faces blurring. The fireplace burned with white flame. "You've gone too far," the curator said. "The library is no longer stable." Alice clutched the book with her name. Now she knew this was not just a place, it was a mechanism, and it had begun to break. Which meant the ending was drawing near, even if it could still be rewritten. The library no longer resembled itself. The air shimmered as if from heat, though the fireplace burned with a strange whitish flame that cast no shadows. Instead, the shadows peeled away from the walls and crawled between the shelves, as if searching for somewhere to hide. Alice stood in the middle of the hall, holding the book with her name on it. She felt its weight not in her hands, but in her chest, as if her heart had become a page on which the final line was about to appear. "This isn't a fire," the curator said, watching as one of the books slowly darkened and crumbled into ash. "It's an ending." "But I didn't finish anything," Alice replied. "I was only trying to save a person." "Exactly," he said softly. "The library cannot endure when one story is saved at the expense of others." A book on a nearby shelf suddenly flared, not with flame, but with light. The text tore itself from the pages, rose into the air, and scattered like a flock of black birds. Alice shuddered. "What will happen to those stories?" "They will not become reality," the curator answered, "and they will not become memories. That is the worst fate." She thought of Lucas, his smile, the awkward way he touched her hand as if afraid of frightening something fragile, of how, in the hospital, he said he didn't fall all the way. He's connected to the library, isn't he? The curator nodded. Now he is. You wove him into the mechanism. If the library disappears, he will return to his original ending. And if it remains, then someone must take my place. The words hung between them, heavy, unmistakable. You want it to be me, Alice whispered. I don't want it, the curator replied, but the library has already chosen. The floor trembled. Somewhere deep in the hall, a ladder crashed down, and the upper shelves began to lower as if space itself were compressing. Books appeared and vanished, covers changed color, titles changed meaning. Alice opened her book. The pages were no longer empty. She understood. Love is not an escape from fate. It is its form. If I stay here, Alice said without lifting her gaze, will he forget me? Yes, the curator replied, and he will live. And if I leave? The curator did not answer at once. The fireplace cracked, and a fragment of flame leapt into the air, turning to ash. Then the story will end the way it was written in the beginning. Alice closed her eyes. She saw Lucas on the bench by the chestnut tree, his palm lightly closing around her fingers, and that look, quiet, trusting, as if he had already found a home. I don't want to be a heroine. I just don't want him to disappear. The library responded. The walls stilled. The shadows returned to their places. The flame in the fireplace grew steady, as if the space itself were holding its breath. Then do the last thing, the curator said, stepping aside to clear a path to the fireplace. Write the ending yourself. On the mantel lay a pen, old with a dark metal nib that reflected no light. Alice stepped forward. Her hand trembled as she bent over the book. She didn't know which words were needed. She only knew they had to be honest. She began to write. Behind her, the curator slowly vanished, not dissolving, not burning, but simply becoming part of the shadow from which he had once emerged. The library groaned, but no longer in pain, in transformation. When Alice placed the final period, the fireplace went out, and in the silence that followed, it became clear the next page would be the most precious of all. When the fireplace went out, the silence became absolute. Not the living kind that once breathed between the shelves, but a deaf one, like afterwords that can no longer be taken back. The light did not vanish at once. It seemed to withdraw slowly, saying goodbye, leaving the library in a half-darkness where everything lost its sharp edges. Alice stood with the pen in her hand. The ink on the page had not yet dried. "Is that all?" she asked, without turning around. There was no answer. The curator had vanished completely. Where he had stood, there was only emptiness, not space, but absence, a place no one else could occupy, except her. The library was slowly changing. The shelves lost their height, as if someone were removing floor after floor. The books grew lighter, thinner. Some became completely empty. The photographs on the walls faded entirely, leaving only the shadows of their frames. Alice walked to the window. Beyond it, there was no city, only a white expanse, without time, without movement. "So this is what it means to stay," she whispered. The book with her name closed itself. The title on the spine disappeared, as if erased with a rubber. Now it was just a book, without an author, without an owner. And at that very moment, Lucas woke up. He was sitting in his apartment, watching the morning light spill across the floor. His head ached, his arm was bandaged, but overall he felt fine, calm, as if something heavy was no longer pressing from within. He got up, made coffee, bitter as always, and sat by the window. It felt as though he had forgotten something, not a word, not a name, an wmешання, a feeling, as if once there had been a different kind of silence nearby, a warmer one. He didn't know why today he felt like taking a different route. In the library, Alice took a new journal, clean, without dates. She opened the first page and wrote, "Stories do not disappear. They simply wait for someone to remember them." The words settled evenly. The library responded with a faint crackle as if it had learned to breathe again. It was different now, smaller, quieter, but stable. Alice understood she would no longer be able to leave, not because she was being held, but because she was holding this place, the way memory holds a person even after they vanish from one's life. And yet, sometimes the library allowed itself small glitches. One day, much later, a man appeared at the threshold. He entered hesitantly, as if unsure why he had come. He looked at the shelves for a long time, touched the spines of the books, frowned. "Excuse me," he said. "This place feels strangely familiar." Alice lifted her gaze. She recognized him at once, not by his face, not by his voice, by the silence around him. "Are you looking for something specific?" she asked calmly. He thought for a moment. "I don't know. Maybe a story I forgot." She nodded and handed him a thin, untitled book. "Then start with this one." Lucas took the book. Their fingers brushed for a moment. And though he did not remember her, his heart skipped a beat, as if it had recognized something more important than memory. Alice smiled. Because some stories do not need names. It is enough that they once existed, and that they can exist again.